Hello, and welcome to Voices from the Field, a Mayford podcast where we talk with educators in the field to hear about their perspectives and experiences. My name is Jake Burson, Advocacy Chair for Mayford, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Shannon Milliken. Just a little bit of background about Shannon. Shannon is the founder and current executive director of the Play Education Corporation, also known as Play Education or Play. Shannon started her career as a physical education teacher. She taught for more than 5 years in a variety of districts within Colorado that ranged from charter to public schools, low socioeconomic status communities to families that had a lot of wealth and opportunities. In 2017, Shannon was the first woman of color to be president of SHAPE Colorado and has served on many local, state, district, national committees regarding physical education, standards leadership, student and staff wellness, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Her passion for advocacy was ignited, and she was instrumental in the beginning conversations and stages of House Bill 19 1161, Comprehensive Physical Education Instruction, pilot in the Colorado legislature. From 2018 to 2022, Shannon worked at the Colorado Department of Education in the Health and Wellness Unit, where she was the principal investigator and project manager for the 1801 Center for Disease Control Prevention. That's the CDC's Healthy Schools Grant, improving student health and academic achievement through nutrition, physical activity, and the management of chronic conditions in schools. She additionally supported state grantees in student and staff wellness, facilitated the statewide School Health Coalition, the Colorado Healthy Schools Collaborative, which is a group of over 100 stakeholders that consisted of schools and districts, government agencies, local public health nonprofits, community partners, all interested and connected in learning together to support the whole child school health initiatives programming. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Shannon supported schools by initiating a cross-collaboration with various and multiple units and departments within CDE in the public health and educational sectors to provide professional development and technical assistance around best practices in nutrition, physical activity, management of chronic conditions, and social emotional climate in and out of school time. Finally, Shannon supported the entire department with creating space for hard conversations around daring leadership, equity, diversity, and inclusion. She is a transracial adoptee and a mother to her beautiful 7-year-old biological daughter, Kaylee, who is her inspiration to be a catalyst for change in the educational and societal systems. She has a Bachelor of Science in Sport and Exercise Science with a K-12 teaching licensure in physical education and a minor in coaching. She also has a Master's of Arts in Physical Education, both degrees from the University of Northern Colorado. Go Bears! Before we get started, what's making you smile these days, Shannon?
Hey,
Welcome.
Jake. Thanks so much. I appreciate that. Great question to start off with. What is making you smile these days? And I think in the world right now that is challenging and hard, we have to remember the little things that make us smile. And so for me, of course, that is my little girl, Kaylee. She is just the light of my life and is so witty and so creative and she challenges me, but I think like when that the intentions are pure and when kids are asking good questions, to know that it is helping with their emotional intelligence to be productive citizens of this world, like that's what makes me smile, because I think nowadays we don't do that enough with kids. And so being having the opportunity to do that with my little girl on a daily basis definitely makes me smile.
That's awesome. That's a great story. So, Shannon, before we get started too, how can you share with our listeners how you started your education journey?
Sure. So I was pondering on this question and I was like, where do I insert this? Like, do I
Mm,
start with like the education journey of when I became a teacher or when I started with this nonprofit? I think I started thinking about I need to go back to like kind of my own education experience of like
mhm,
what started my education journey is how I was treated in the education system. And it was you achieve, you get A pluses, you're on the honor roll, you excel. And if you do these things, you will be successful.
mm,
If you do these things, you will be happy. If you do these things, you will be seen. you will be valued, you will be worthy. And that is the narrative that I was told my entire life growing up in schools. And so I worked hard. And if I couldn't do it like through like regurgitation of like facts, I would make up for it in like creativity or professionalism. So I was the kid who was seen as the quote unquote overachiever, right? Or even was given the sayings like the brown noser, right? Of Shannon does these elaborate projects to make up for where I couldn't do it in the knowledge or the book smarts, if that makes sense. Because for me, it wasn't okay to just be okay with a C, right? Or with a B or whatever. Like I had to be overachieving in order to be seen. And so that's where my education journey started. And because I'm realizing now, being out of that system, and seeing the fallout of, wait, I followed all the rules and you told me that I was going to be XYZ and that didn't happen. You start to question everything that you were told as a child,
Mm,
right? And
right.
so now that I'm kind of questioning that, I now think about, oh, well, are there other kids out there who are just like me, who either learn differently or maybe ask too many questions, right? Because you are more of a systematic thinker. Do you value things versus like reading and math? Like I value movement. And so I think it's just started these questions of like, is our education system meeting the needs of all children? Or have we kind of generalized this approach and said just systematically, like, this is how you're going to be successful?
Right, without taking a second look. You're taking your own experience you had and reflecting on that, and you're saying, oh, maybe so there's some other kids who are going through the same process or the same experience, and what can we do to help these individuals?
You got it. Yep.
Interesting. So, Shannon, as a former physical education teacher and a mom, what made you realize the need for systemic change in how we educate children? You kind of touched a little bit about this in the last response, but if you could elaborate further.
Sure. As physical educators, we have the best job in the world, right? And the misconception, right, is like we have the best jobs in the world because we get to wear sweats every day and
Hmm.
because you get to move around and play games and your recess and wiggles and jiggles out and your common plan periods for teachers who really are the core subjects. And I think for me, physical education has always been education through movement. It is the way that we can, I mean, and research supports this. When you're moving, right, you can retain information better. You can learn better. When we have healthy environments, kids can learn better. And so I think as a physical education teacher, my belief has always been this is the best way that we can help kids retain the information that we expect them to learn and know. And me personally, as a physical education teacher, when I was in schools, physical education was not valued as an essential subject, right? It was all of those things that I kind of mentioned earlier as a misconception. And so when I think about, again, myself being a kinesthetic learner, how many times are there opportunities for us to change the environments in which children are learning so that they can achieve or produce, right? And I'm doing air quotes right now of what we expect for kids. Why are we not creating these environments that are statistically showing that kids can learn better if they are in these types of environments? And so as a teacher, I'm like, we're not doing that. And now as a mom, being an advocate for my daughter and saying, no, she needs spaces where she can learn the best, and it may not be sitting in a chair regurgitating information, right? That's where I'm starting to be like, okay, the systems are designed for a one size fits all. And if you are not in that one size fits all, what do we do for you? And I
Mm,
think that's where we're in this limbo right now of like, we know that the current system may not be working for all kids, but what do we do differently? And because we don't know, we continue to do what we've always done. But
mm,
we're seeing the impact, right, of what's happening when children are not being seen, when they're not being valued, when they're not being heard, when they're not part of the ecosystem of our education system. We're seeing the negative impacts because we're losing our children too soon. And I'm just going to be very blunt and honest about that. Our
Mhm.
children are dying too soon. And so, what do we need to do to change that? And I believe that it's within our education system.
Well, thank you for that response. I'm going to switch the order around my questions because I think it'll flow better. So, given
Sure.
your work in various school districts, what are you mentioned some of the inequities, but what are some other inequities you saw in maybe some different communities, and how does that inform the work that Play does today?
Yeah, so I think some of the inequities that I saw was really during COVID when I was at the Department of Education and we were trying to give technical assistance to here in Colorado, we have 176 school districts, right? And
Mhm.
so we were trying to meet the needs of everybody. And we saw the disparities in access, in resources, in funding, in the way that we were distributing support, right? Like all of those inequities we were starting to see during COVID. And the narrative was, well, COVID created these discrepancies or these
Mhm.
disparities. And it's like, well, no, they just shed light on it because now we
Mhm.
don't have a way to mask, right, these inequities.
Right.
So when you talk about, I think mostly when we talk about vulnerable populations, a lot of times the conversation goes right to, okay, well, you're talking about kids of color, which don't get me wrong, kids of color are a vulnerable population, but let's also talk about rural districts. Let's also talk about kids who have chronic conditions, which has nothing to do with skin color, right? Let's talk about kids who are unsheltered, right? Or kids who are in foster care, kids with disabilities, right? All of these are inequities or vulnerable populations that we were seeing the school system was not necessarily serving or they weren't prepared to serve when COVID hit. And so that for me was like this aha of, oh, we do need to be doing something because what we currently are doing is leaving this huge gap. And I think for us, how it's informing the work that Play is doing right now is it really is identifying the priorities and the communities that we're wanting to serve.
Mhm.
Not to say like we're not serving all children, but we're mindful and we're aware of those vulnerable populations so that when we are providing technical assistance or we are supporting schools or communities, we can have those conversations or bring in the experts that serve those communities and those populations to say, what are we missing? And I think just being aware of those disparities and being aware of the inequities is how you start those conversations to ensure that representation is included in the conversations and in the assistance you're providing to schools.
Great answer. Yeah, I agree with you. COVID shed a lot on a lot of things that should be happening but weren't happening, and it affected obviously everybody and all the educators and just everybody in general. So, as founder and executive director of Play Education Corporation, what values or leadership principles guide you every day?
I think accountability and I like to use the word vulnerability.
Mhm.
There's a lot of I think conversation around the difference between honesty, transparency and vulnerability. Something that I heard from somebody was, honesty is I'm going to tell you how I feel. Transparency is I'm going to be honest and I'm going to give you I'm gonna tell you how I feel in this moment. And then vulnerability is I actually can tell you something that you could technically use it against me later on. And when you're vulnerable, you're trusting somebody to be in that space with you in that moment. And I think for me, being vulnerable in sharing my story, but also why we're doing the things that we do is really important in this leadership space because we're modeling what we're saying we want to do for kids. So when we're saying we're creating a safe space for you, okay, are we ready to really create that safe space? And do we know what that safe space means for every single student? And so, like, just even in our language, we don't even use the word safe space anymore. We use the word brave space. And so we model from the top down what are some of these best practices around equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging, not necessarily from an academia point, but from a lived experience perspective and saying, if this is what we are preaching, if this is what we're talking about, we need to be able to live it too. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was accountability, right? so much in the world right now is we want to be doing good, but if we make a mistake, right? Or if we tried something and we failed, my lived experience has been, oh, I don't want to take accountability for that, so I'm going to blame it on somebody else, or I am going to scapegoat and
Hmm.
not take accountability. Where for us, that leadership principle is we are going to take accountability. But in order to do that, we need to be educated first so that, right, we're not being put kind of in those really tricky situations. And so sometimes it means we're not speaking out. Sometimes it means that we're waiting. Sometimes it means we're not on the front lines fighting, right? And so that accountability and that restraint is another leadership principle that really helps guide our work because we want to be educated in our decisions and we want to give information so that others can make their own educated decisions instead of us saying this is what you should believe.
There's a lot of information there. So I have a follow-up question in regards to the honesty, transparency, and vulnerability. Do you find that when you're working with different districts or different people that they have one more over the other? How do you get somebody to be how can you encourage them to be more honest, or how can you encourage them to be vulnerable, to kind of put themselves in a situation where they need to talk more, they need to explain more, they need to just be honest more. You know what I'm saying? Like, how do we? Is that something that potentially people aren't comfortable with right away? So, what are some strategies, or what are some things that suggestions you have for getting people to be more honest and really take that leap? Does that make sense?
Yeah. That's a great question. And I wish I had the answer, right? I
Mhm.
always tell people this in my presentations because people will be like, we want the tangible strategies.
Right.
And I always say, I wish my presentation was three slides. Here's the problem, here's how you fix it. Now go do it,
Right.
right? And so to answer your question, what I have learned in my own journey and
Mhm.
when I am working with other districts and just different communities is you can't make people do it, right? You can't tell people show up vulnerably. You can't tell people be honest, right? You can
Mhm.
tell them that, but for them to actually do it, you have to be able to model it yourself and you
Mhm.
have to be able to look inwardly at what are you doing, right? Are you either modeling this yourself or do you have some work to do? And I think that's a really hard thing to do, right?
Mhm.
Because we as a society, once again, have created this narrative of like, you are worthy, you are valuable if you are perfect, right? And
Right.
so anything that contradicts perfection, whether that's intentional or not, we have learned how to armor up. We have learned how to not to cover it up so that people don't see us weak, right? They don't see us as failures.
Mhm.
And so we mask it through our armor, through sarcasm, through being funny, through being quiet, through scapegoating, through all of these
Mhm.
other behaviors. And really, what it comes down to is we need to be willing to look inward and say, how am I contributing to the problem?
Hmm.
And that's a really hard thing to acknowledge to yourself is I am part of the problem. And what do I have to change in order to be part of the solution? And so that awareness of that I am part of the problem, and then doing our own education and our own leaning in into how do I become better? That's how we get honesty, transparency, and vulnerability in brave spaces. But it means that you need to show up and it means that you have to do the hard work. And that's a
Right.
really hard thing to ask people to do right now.
Right. A lot of self-reflection and self-awareness that has to be developed for sure.
Absolutely.
So one of Play's guiding principles is please learn as you. So how did you land on that phrase?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I cannot take credit for it. When I was actually teaching, I guess it's almost like 15 years ago, brain-based learning was kind of like a huge thing, right? Of
Mhm.
like, we want kids to be moving before their like toughest subject because it activates the brain. And so I was taking a professional development on brain-based learning, and one of the trainers they were talking about recess, and they were talking that kids need to be able to play and they need to be able to please learn as you. And that when she said that, I was like, that resonates with me so much
Mhm.
because I'm not like everybody else. And what I didn't know at the time was, oh, because I look different, I'm being treated differently. Therefore, I'm feeling something internally like there's something wrong with me, right? Like I didn't have that language when you're 16, 8 years old, whatever age you are, right? But now I do have that language. And so now I'm sitting here going like, oh, having the ability to learn how I learn best, how empowering is that, right? For
Mm.
a child to be able to advocate for themselves of this is what I need in order to learn. And so, and then it just seemed fitting for being a physical educator, right? And wanting to play and move. It just seemed like it was very fitting. But it is the fundamental, we obviously have a vision and a mission, but it is the fundamental phrase of why our organization exists is just so kids can please learn as you.
Be your, I love it. I mean, that's great. It's a great phrase. Play uses CDC's whole school, whole community, whole child. It's called the WISC model, right?
Correct. Yes.
Can you tell us a little about the WISC model and why you chose to use this particular framework in relation to play? What are the benefits of this model?
Yeah, so I mean, high level,
Mhm.
right? For those of you who are not familiar with the whole school, whole community, whole child model, also known as WISC, like a WISC, it bridges the academia and the education sector with the public health sector, which supports that research that says when students are healthy, they learn better. And so before the WISC model existed, there was coordinated school health, which was kind of like the public health model. And
Mhm.
then there was the whole child model, which was really around education. Well, when that research is coming out saying, oh, when kids are learning better, when they're healthy, CDC and ASCD, so CDC is public health, ASCD is education, they came together and was like, oh, we should have a coordinated model, right? Something that works together. And so that's how whole school, whole community, whole child model was created. Now, why Play uses that is because once again, when I was at the Department of Education during COVID, everybody wanted to support schools, which I thought was awesome, right? But everybody was coming out with their own model, everybody was coming out with their own resources, everybody was coming out with their own curriculums, right? And schools were overwhelmed. It
Right.
was one more thing. And because schools are already tapped out, let alone you add in a pandemic on top of that, right? They don't have the capacity to be reaching out to these organizations saying, tell me about your curriculum. Tell me about your resource. Tell me about how you can help our students. They don't have that capacity. And so what happens is nothing happens. And who does that impact? It impacts our students. And
Mm.
so when play, so something that makes play very unique is we don't have our own resources. We don't have our own curriculum. We use systems that have already been vetted and proven because we don't want to be one more thing. And so CDC being the National Center for Public Health, we're like, yes, we want to use this model because it has already been validated, it's already realistic, it's already proven that it works. So why would we try to reinvent the wheel? Let's already use something that's proven, that has resources attached to it, that has with Healthy Kids, well, here in Colorado, it's called the Healthy Kids Colorado Survey, which
Mhm.
for all the other states, it's the YRBS, so the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, I think is what it's
Yeah,
called.
that's it. Yep.
So like there's already tools attached to this framework and this approach. So why would we try to create something outside of that? Because it really does allow us to then I guess be more efficient and effective and gives us credibility in the sense of, oh, we're already using a model that already exists versus here, I'm going to prove it to you. It really does help streamline our work.
So getting all these people that you work with around the same table, how does that work? If you were you work there's so in the WISC model, there's family engagement, there's health education, physical education, there's health services, employee wellness. How do you go about getting kind of everybody on the same page? Are there meetings? Are there agendas? How does that work? You can.
Yeah, so it's interesting because there's definitely different ways that you can approach this, right?
Mhm.
A lot of times you can approach it by just kind of like inserting yourself in and saying, we just want to focus on XYZ. So a lot of
Right.
times It's like, we want to focus on staff wellness or we
Hmm.
want to focus on social emotional learning. So we're going to fund those components,
Got
right?
it. Got
And
it.
then what happens is like, then it's like, okay, well, then these organizations have programs that support that. So we're going to implement the program. But you touch on a really cool point of the infrastructure, right? Of you want a system that is supporting healthy environments. You don't want healthy school environment programs. You want a healthy school environment infrastructure. And that is what's created by bringing the various stakeholders together who are almost content experts in those components that you're talking about. I think a lot of times people are like, oh, we have to have everybody at the table in the school at the school health advisory council meetings. And so school health advisory council is the infrastructure council in the school level where diverse stakeholders come together, they identify needs, they action plan, they figure out how they're going to address their needs, and then they evaluate the impact. But what's cool about that is that when you engage stakeholders throughout the community that specialize in these topics, you're now looking at sustainability. So now, if a teacher, right, heaven forbid your physical education teacher leaves, right? Well, now you've got a gap in the physical education, physical activity sector. But if you've engaged community members like the rec center,
Hmm.
right, youth programs and out of school time, your PE teacher might leave, but now you still have stakeholders in the community that are invested and can still support the school in the infrastructure piece. And so
Right.
it's developing those communities and relying upon the community to hold the sustainability within the school. And that's part of that WISC model, because if you were to look at the WISC model, right,
Hmm.
community wraps around the whole model, right?
Right.
And so, and I know it might be a little hard for people to visualize it, but when you think about it, it's like community is wrapping the child in a big hug, right? So when
Hmm.
you think about creating sustainability or infrastructure, it's all around the community. It's engaging your community. It's having your community be invested in the school and in the students that it serves.
Yeah, I'm looking at the graphic right now, and you're right. The community is at the outer side, the outermost of the circle here.
Yeah.
Cool. So, are there any transformation stories or any stories that have stood out for you in your work with districts? Are there any? What can you elaborate on?
Yeah, so we are a newer nonprofit. We
Hmm.
just celebrated our first year. Yay.
Hey.
But what's been really cool about this is we actually have identified a pilot school this year. And
Oh.
what's been awesome is like healthy schools work, it's not new work. It's
Hmm.
been around for years. And specifically here in Colorado, we've had philanthropists and funders supporting this work, and great stuff has happened from it. But what we haven't seen is the sustainability piece. And so, something that's been transformational about our pilot school is we have been able to scale this to kind of like a best practice model. So, we're saying, okay, if you had unlimited funding, unlimited capacity, unlimited support from leadership, this is what this could look like. Part of the work that Play does is we really specialize in knowing the school community that we serve because every school community is different.
Right.
So from our pilot school, there's an elementary school that's 5 miles down the road.
Hmm.
They're going to have completely different needs, right?
Hmm.
Because their school demographics are different, their community is different. And so what's really cool about the scalable model that we're doing is when we take this model of best practice into the school that's 5 miles down the road, there might be some community barriers or some school barriers that we didn't necessarily have at our pilot school. And so we're able to then shift and mold and say like, oh, okay, here's what the best practice is, but you're not quite there yet. So here's how we can kind of tier it down to meet you where you're at. Because the generalized approach that we see in some larger organizations, it doesn't fit the needs of that school and or the student demographic. And
Hmm.
where that's an issue is that if our most vulnerable youth and marginalized communities are not considered in that implementation, they're the ones who continue to be left behind. And
Right.
so you create that gap that's even bigger. So it's so important to make sure that you're meeting the needs of that particular school. And so that transformation that we're talking about is so cool because we've been able to create it at a best practice level and then scale it. And then we'll be able to scale it down as we go into different schools.
So you have this model, right?
Yeah, so we
Or
use the CDC's
yeah.
framework and
Mm.
approach, but then utilizing the best practices of identifying needs, implementation, collecting data. We're doing it a lot of times. You'll be like, well, we can't do this because this is a barrier. We can't
Mhm.
do this because this is a barrier. We're really lucky in our pilot school where we're just kind of like, do whatever you want. And so we're able to really say, if we were able to do this perfectly, this is what it would take so that we can help schools get there. We know what it takes to have this at the high level. And so it's like, okay, you're going to need $20,000. Here, let's help you find that money, right? Or, oh, you're going to need volunteers from the community. Let's start creating that council now and start reaching out into the community now because we know what it takes to have this be perfect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So, in other words, because you know what it takes and you have the best practices, you can tailor what each district and what the individual needs based on the best practices. And like you said, we can't leave the voices out of the people who need it the most, the vulnerable. So we got to bring many voices in to the table and hear what
Yes.
people have to say.
Yes, you got it.
Awesome, awesome. So that kind of lead me to my next question, which is how does play ensure that underrepresented voices, it could be racial, socioeconomic, disability, are at the center of its programs and decision making?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it goes all the way back to kind of what we were originally talking about earlier is just having the awareness,
Hmm.
right? Being aware that what you currently are doing, good intentioned, right? As well intentioned as it is, there might be some gaps, right? And so just that awareness is number one, right?
Hmm.
Because then that allows you to be open to what are we missing, right? And then when you're able to look at what are we missing, that's when you're able to start looking at your school community and your demographics, right? And you're able to say, okay, let's look at some data, right? Where are these gaps? Where are we seeing influxes or I don't know, what's the opposite of an influx? I don't know. This
A
is gonna
reduction? A reduction?
Reduction. Thank you. Yes, that's a great, like, where are we starting to see this in the data, right? Because then that helps us understand who do we need to be serving. And again, it's really important for us to understand that underrepresented voices, a lot of times, right, it's just assumed that it's kids of color. And so some of the feedback that I've gotten is, well, we don't have kids of color, so we don't need to be talking about this. And it's like, well, no, let's have some more in-depth conversations, right? Like, yeah, students, I think the biggest thing for us in physical education is our kids with chronic conditions, right? Kids who have asthma, kids who have anaphylaxis, shock with food allergies. Oral health is a big one. We see all the kids in the school, right? It's our responsibility to know how these chronic conditions are impacting our students. So it's really important for us to understand who are the underrepresented voices in our school community, but also recognizing that underrepresented voices doesn't necessarily just mean kids of color. And so being aware of what are some underrepresented voices in our community specifically, because not every underrepresented voice is going to be the same. And I'll just use an example. One of our board members last year, he was in Arizona and high Hispanic, Spanish speaking population. So
Mhm.
they were actually the majority when you look at like the numbers. And so when you were to go to underrepresented voice, you look at the numbers and you're like, yeah, the Mexican community, and I'm sorry if I am politically incorrect in identifying that, but you would say, oh, that's the majority, right? But then when you look at the policies and who are in positions of power, it was actually individuals who were Caucasian and they were making policies that were not supporting two working like families who work two jobs,
Mhm.
right? Dual income families. They weren't taking that into consideration because that wasn't their lived experience. But
Mhm.
because you see the data that says, oh, well, this is the majority, therefore you shouldn't be thinking about this. Do you see where the discrepancy lies of like really needing to understand who is considered underrepresented in your specific school community?
Right. And the people making the decisions need to really be aware of that. Because if they're not, you're going to keep having the challenges that we've been having. So again, you keep coming back to this word, the self-awareness and reflection and being really open to changing. So speaking of change, what are some policy changes you'd most like to see in education to support truly whole child learning environments?
Yeah, so that's what's really cool about play education. Even though we are a very small nonprofit right now, we have a 10-year strategic plan because we know where we want to go. We have to be starting to support the environments where children are producing what we want. We're just producing children to go through this system,
Right.
but we're not reflecting, we're not thinking about kids who are getting pushed through the system. How is this impacting them? Are we really setting them up for success? And I'm going to be that person that's going to push back and say, we're not. And that's because my belief is no child is expendable, right? Even if it's one kid, they
Mm.
deserve a champion. And I think my personal belief of, and selfishly, I know that my daughter has privilege because I have privilege. And so I'm
Mm.
able to be a champion for her. I think about children who don't have a champion,
Mm.
right? And it's not their fault, but what barriers are existing, right? That are contributing to them not having a champion. And I believe that it is my sole purpose here in life right now is to identify what those barriers are and to be that champion for that one kid. Because I wish that I would have had that adult who saw me as that one individual who was like, she needs some help. She needs some support. What does she need? I want to be that adult for those kids.
That's awesome, Shannon. You are definitely a champion for a lot of people. If
Thank you.
you,
I appreciate that.
for sure, if you could leave a piece of wisdom or advice for our listeners, what would it be?
I'm just going to go with my gut and it continue to show up. Be brave enough to show up. It's uncomfortable. It's hard. What we're navigating right now, no matter what we believe, no matter how we were raised, whatever divide, right, that is happening between you and somebody else,
Mm.
right? Like continue to lean in, continue to show up because when you do, the learn like we are most when we are most uncomfortable, that is when the most growth happens. And so if we push ourselves to be uncomfortable, to step into those brave spaces, to have hard conversations, we will start to learn our awarenesses. We will start to learn our biases. We will start to identify the kids that we haven't been able to reach because of those barriers. And that one kid, right, is not expendable. When we're aware, we might see that one kid who has been invisible to us this entire time. And so continue to show up and continue to lean into these brave and uncomfortable spaces because it makes a difference for that one kid.
I love it. That's great advice. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. That's really how you grow. Like you said, you really grow when you're in that uncomfortable position, right? So, awesome
Yeah.
advice. So, are you on social media, Shannon? How can our listeners find out more about Play and help support your mission?
Yeah, so our biggest place for you to follow the work that we're doing is on our
Hmm.
Instagram,
Okay.
which is theplayedcorp.com, or it's just the playedcorp. Best way for you to see the work that we're doing, to support the work that we're doing, especially right now as a small nonprofit. It doesn't even have to be about money, right?
Hmm.
Sharing, liking, commenting, right? Like, I mean, I don't even know the algorithms of social media, but I've heard that it helps, so it could help. But I think if anything, let it inspire you, right? Because again, we don't have a descriptive of like a one size fits all. So if you see something that we're doing and you're like, yep, we couldn't do it, that's okay. It's supposed to inspire you. So then reach out to us and be like, hey, we really liked what we saw. Do you have any ideas of how we could do this at our school or in our community? This is what our situation is. That's what we're priding ourselves on is these conversations to say, this is what your situation is. These are the students you are serving. How do we get XYZ into your community to support these children? And so, kind of like what you were just saying now, what's one piece of advice? Connect with us, right? Send me a message. Ask. Just be like, I saw this and I want to learn more. It's okay that you don't know. Lean into that uncomfortableness and learn more. And so yeah, Instagram is probably the best way to follow us, but so is our website. We have a Pushing Boundaries webinar series that will
Hmm.
be relaunching next spring, which we are so excited about because we highlight speakers that are pushing boundaries, that are challenging the status quo, and that are really encouraging us to think outside of the box. So if you're like, hey, I don't know where to start stepping into these spaces of uncomfortable conversations, show up to these webinars. Maybe it'll like light something for you. Or maybe you're like, oh, I really want to learn more from this speaker. So yeah, if you're kind of like, ooh, where do I even start these things? Show up to our webinars, which is on our website.
I was just going to ask, everything is going to be on your website, right? Contact
Yep.
webinars, all the
Yep.
information. Awesome. Well, Shannon, thank you so much for sharing your experience and expertise with us. I learned so much. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot too. So really appreciate your time.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Definitely. Thank you. Listeners, if you have any questions, you can always email us. We'll have this episode uploaded soon. Also, we're asking our listeners to rate and share the podcast if it has helped you in any way. Thank you all for listening. Have a great week, and we will be back soon.